welcome to Grid Talk. My name is Ruby Price. Today we are here for part two of our 2025 Formula One season driver grades. A big thank you once again to Green Wheels India for sponsoring this episode of Grid Talk. Head to greenwheels.in to check them out. And join me today once again, it would be a surprise if he wasn't here, is Louis Edwards.
Hello again.
Hello once again. Before we get into part two, make sure you go and check out part one of our driver grades where we cover everyone who we assigned a grade between C and F. So if you're wondering why we aren't discussing the incredible seasons of Lance Stroll, Yuki Tsunoda, or Lewis Hamilton, you're going to need to go and listen to part one. But, let's stop with the preamble. Let's get down to part two of our driver grades episode, starting with the B tier. And let's kick it off with Kimi Antonelli. We've given him a B. I gave him a B. Louis, you gave him a C, and a mid-season point, we gave him a C as well. He was the rookie with all the hype, and there were some standout performances. Sprint pole in Miami, his podiums in Brazil, Canada, and Vegas. But it was kind of a troubled mid-season, I think, and that's kind of where Kimi Antonelli really needed to knuckle down and turn things around almost before, Mercedes want to get him to a par with George Russell at some point, because they've only finished second in the constructors because of the fact that they've not picked up a decent amount of points between the two of their drivers, is at least what I'd probably say.
Yeah, the reason why I was maybe a little bit more critical of Antonelli than most of others on Grid Talk is because of these just random kind of drops in his form, like why he would go on a good run of points and then suddenly finish 13th, and then he'd go on a good run of points and he's only 15th, and there, as you mentioned, that kind of mid-season of just not scoring any points wasn't a great run, so I struggle to give him like a B, but I don't think it's been a bad season. I think, as mentioned in part one of this podcast, I said that I think this crop of rookies has been very solid, and I do include Kimi Antonelli in that. I think he has had a great season in the terms that he's managed to get the podium points. He is in a very competitive car, which means I have to judge him differently from the likes of Hadjar and Behrman and Bortoletto, all drivers who are in these midfield, back of the field cars. And Antonelli's pushed into Mercedes, which hasn't been slow in any matter. Sure, Mercedes haven't been nearly as consistent as we've seen in previous seasons, but there was a little bit more expectation of what he needs to do in comparative to his teammates and what he needs to be doing in comparative to other drivers in those top four teams. And I don't feel as though he has been as much of a standout as the likes of a Charles Leclerc, as a George Russell, as a Max Verstappen, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris in those sort of top field teams. So that's why I gave it. I mean, I can respect a B. That's not my personal opinion. It's the opinion of everyone here at Grid Talk. So it's definitely not been a bad season. I definitely don't want to feel like I'm criticizing Kimi Antonelli because he has scored some incredible results and is worthy of the pole positions that he's got, the podiums that he's got this season. It is great for a rookie to come in and do that. I just don't think given the car that he's lived as much up to the potential as some other drivers.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. And, I think the things that's worth mentioning as well, the results where he's had to come through the field in order to get them. And granted, there was a bit of luck, Las Vegas started 17th on the grid and strategy is really what saved him that day in order to get that podium. But, starting off the season as well, Australia in P16, finishing P4. These are results and drives that you expect from someone who's got a lot more mileage under their belt, to be able to cut through the field and still finish off with a decent performance, having not had the best in terms of qualifying performances. But yeah, Kimi Antonelli, a bit more learning to do and a bit more rounding of him. But I think we're certainly looking at one of those drivers that's going to be in Formula One for the long haul and is going to, do something quite special, provided he gets given the equipment to do something special with. Mercedes not quite at the top of the field as they used to be, but, certainly giving him something to be able to finish on the podium with and get those sprint poles and, at some point we'll be able to say, I think, proper pole because, everyone, there's always that asterisk when it comes to a sprint. We talk about podiums and things that people don't get, but when it comes to the sprints, it's like, yeah, but it's still a competitive session, right? But there's still that asterisk next to it. But yeah, 2026, Kimi Antonelli. Let's see some of these things without the asterisks at the very least. And let's move on to, you've said a lot over these two parts about, a good field of rookies. Let's talk about everybody's favorite rookie, Fernando Alonso, in his 38th rookie season, 40th rookie season, 100th rookie season. Now, we've given him a B, of course. At the mid-season point, we'd give him a C. I gave him a C at this point as well, but you gave him a B. It took until Spain for Fernando to get his first points of the season, but from that point, he did obviously start to turn things around and was always hampered a little bit by Aston Martin not really knowing why they were quick, just that they were, like Hungary, for example. I think they brought a new front wing and they were just a bit quicker and that gave them some pace. But it did occasionally seem that, like, the strategists of Aston Martin would go, okay, things have gone wrong. Let's just get to the end of the race. And Fernando, many a colourful radio message came through. But what did you think of, your favourite driver's season this season?
Yeah, it definitely did get off to a bit of a tricky start, and I think no one's going to deny that. Like, he kept coming so close to getting points after battling some DNS and some horrid luck. Like, he was sitting in points positions and then he'd just be robbed of it. It's definitely wasn't an easy time. But from Spain onwards, he has been the driver that Aston Martin has needed him to be because, let's face it, Lance Stroll isn't. Ever since the summer break, he really showed his mettle, scored almost like three times the amount of points that Lance scored in the second half of the season. Got some great qualifying performances, great race performances in a car that, as you said, was sometimes fast and nobody had any idea why. I think Las Vegas was a weird sort of weekend for Aston Martin where, because of the rain in the qualifying, they started to look incredibly fast, but they did kind of peter off in the race. But I don't know, as Fernando has been, again, he's just been the driver that Aston Martin has needed. He's pulled the points out of the bags. He's been as consistent as they can be because that Aston Martin has gone from being the 10th fastest car to then like the fifth fastest car to then being like the seventh to the eighth and then back to fifth and to 10th, just weekend by weekend. It's been a mess. And Lance's performance, I think you look at Lance's performance, you can usually judge where that car was at that point. But when you look at Fernando's cars, that line is a little bit more blurred because he would get performances which far outweighed just how quick that car was. And yeah, people at the start of the season, I mentioned it in the last one, where people were like, oh, Lance has finally come good. He's taking control. He's pushing forward. Fernando finished 10th in the championship this season. He scored a lot more points. He scored a lot more point finishes. He did have a better season yet again.
Yet again. It is a tricky one to always judge where Fernando Alonso is, as you say, like just based on the fact that like his teammate for the last few seasons has been Lance Stroll, and I don't think it's a reliable barometer for form because we know what Lance Stroll is like. But yeah, it is certainly a good, like, it's known that Fernando Alonso will always try and extract the maximum amount of performance out of a car. When he was driving for McLaren Honda, how often were we saying that he was the reason as to why they showed any promise on a race weekend whatsoever? Because he would always push so much further than the car should have been doing. And, it was like he had his own overtake button himself just on the car, just giving it that little bit more pace. And, you know, any other car on the grid, I think, you see a Fernando Alonso that, maybe is even in that top eight, maybe the top seven or six, but, because of the fact that, we don't really know where Aston Martin should be, it's difficult to judge, I think, which is why, like I gave him a C, but I can see the justifications for a B because he has consistently outperformed his teammate and was that reliable source of points that Aston Martin needed when his teammate wasn't providing it, So yeah, Aston Martin, Fernando Alonso, a B. And let's move on to Williams, who, have secured their best result in the constructors in a very long time, thanks to two very good performances, I think, through the season, particularly the second half, from Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. Alex Albon, we've given a B. You've given him a B. He had a B at the mid-season as well. And in that season where it seemed as though the Williams couldn't have two drivers performing well across a weekend, it could only ever be one of them. I think Albon had the more consistent season of the two of the drivers, whilst Carlos Sainz obviously had to get to grips with the new team. But as the Williams performance tapered off because they put so much of their eggs into the 2026 basket, so too did the performances for Alex Albon at the very least.
Yeah, he did have a really good start, and he was the one that was leading the team, as you said, and it is reflected by a lot of his like big race performances coming early on. But I think ultimately Alex has been comfortable all year. He's not had to be the one who's needed to prove anything. I think Signs with his poor start, he had something to prove, and that's why we've seen some of these great results come latter in this latter half of the season. But Alex has had just a very solid, very good season as we've come to expect from Albon since he joined Williams. He's done a great job. He's the one leading the team, doing everything he possibly can just to keep the team plugging along. And if Williams get it right, it is hard to argue that they don't have one of the strongest lineups on the grid with an Alex Albon who is a lot more experienced than I think people give him credit for. He has been in the sport for quite a long time, comparatively for a Formula One driver. Like a lot of drivers don't make it. He almost hasn't made it to this point, but he's been brilliant and solid and good. And even if when he hasn't scored points, he's been near the points. It's one of those sort of metrics where when he's outside the points, it's not like he's finishing 16th, 17th. He's finishing 12th. He's finishing 11th, 13th. It's kind of always that near or near about. He's never far away from points, even when he's not scoring them. He's been doing brilliantly. And yeah, solid. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, definitely. His average finishing position in a Grand Prix being P11.04, like, I think just speaks to that consistency of at least if he wasn't finishing in the points, he was finishing in the position where you inherit points if someone ahead of you gets disqualified, for example. That's where Williams have needed to be, I think, generally. Like, we want them higher because Williams are a team with a big legacy. And, as Brits, we're always going to support the British teams. There is British bias, she says. But it's nice to see Williams have that good performance, I think. And as you say, they've got a very solid lineup. And, we'll also cover Carlos Sainz, of course. He's got a B. I've given him a B. You gave him a C. Mid-season as a C. I think the surprise podiums that even Carlos wasn't really expecting to see are the things that really like have solidified this B performance from Carlos Sainz. It was a troubled start to life at a new team, that clearly, all the narrative around last season, Carlos didn't really want to leave Ferrari, but I think given his performances this season, they've shown that he doesn't need to be at Ferrari to have a decent Formula One career. And it's turned things around in the second half of the season, which he needed to do to prove that he wasn't just good because he was in a car that just happened to be in that position. And, I think what it gives the opportunity for is if Williams do get it right next season, the results that he's had in this second half of the season are going to give him that momentum to be the driver that can go. You see those podiums trophies that we've got from 2025? How about you, we're not exactly talking papaya rules over at Williams, but cyan is definitely not turquoise at the very least. Sky blue rules? Nah.
Yeah, you only say that because you're a Coventry fan.
Yeah, Frank Lampard's joining the team next season.
I'm looking at my C grade of Carlos Sainz and realize that I probably shouldn't have done that.
At least you admit it on the podcast.
I'm more than happy to admit that Carlos Sainz should not be getting a C. As I see it, he did definitely have a troubled start, and it was not the happiest of times for Carlos at the start of the season, especially when Alex was getting these like fifth places, sixth places, getting these big results, and he was really scrapping it out for them sort of lower points. He was really off in terms of qualifying as well, having to really scrap for every single point that he was getting. But then got in this sort of latter half of the season where he has scored these big points, but then he's also had these really random kind of off points throughout. So that's the only reason why I would say he'd be lower, or I could even possibly justify giving him a C. These sometimes random low scoring, but as we said earlier, like Albon had this kind of second half where he didn't score that many points, but you can't argue against two podiums. It's the like one in Azerbaijan, one in Qatar. He's been doing excellent, and Carlos is he's potentially going to go down as one of the most underrated and overlooked drivers in Formula One. He has been amazing in nearly every team that he's been to. He has been one of the best drivers in Formula One since 2019, pretty consistently when he was at McLaren, when he was at Ferrari, and now this kind of second half of the season at Williams, he's really started to gel with the team, started to get behind this vision that James Vowles has of this team. And, we see this as a downgrade for Carlos. But with these new regulations, it is a huge mixing point. We don't know. It's like 2014 all over again. We don't know what is going to happen. And if this gamble that James Vowles have been very open about, that they're like, trash the car, we don't care, we are rebuilding this team starts in 2026. These two seasons don't matter, yet he's managed to score two podiums. There is something special there. And with Albon, with Carlos, it is definitely hard to argue against that. They've got one of the strongest driver lineups. There's a lot of possibility here, and a great sort of back end of the season is really going to give Carlos the momentum, as you said, and the energy that he needs to know that there is something. There's a good chemistry with this team, and a lot can be achieved.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as well, just going back to your point about Carlos Sainz consistently being one of the best and underappreciated drivers since he joined Formula One. 2021, Max and Lewis were in a league of their own. I think everybody else agreed that Carlos Sainz, apart from those two drivers, was the best driver of that season. And he'd just gone into a new team at that point, which was the Ferrari, and he just got to grips with it so much better than Charles Leclerc did that season. Charles Leclerc was never going to be the driver that Ferrari dropped. And I think the fact as well that we're about to touch on, is that, that was never going to happen. But, you could, I think if it weren't for Charles Leclerc, you could have made a reason for Carlos Sainz being the driver to be alongside Lewis Hamilton this season in Ferrari. But let's move on to Charles Leclerc as the last of our B grade drivers. We both gave him a B, which is an improvement on the mid-season of a C that we did. If Charles Leclerc was in a different team, it just makes you wonder what might have been, because he has somehow managed to achieve 7 podiums in that Ferrari, an average position of 6.79, whilst his teammates down, with the 8.46. He has, I think, outdriven an absolute tractor of a car to a P5 in the championship, 242 points. Charles Leclerc deserves Charles Leclerc doesn't need Ferrari, but I think Ferrari needed Charles Leclerc, is what I was trying to say that as almost.
Yeah, this kind of late. Ferrari always do this weird kind of late surge with Charles to try and, like, usually around the Cota kind of time period to try and rescue any remnants of whatever disaster that their season has been up to that point. And Charles has been a solid driver, just unfortunately plagued by a dog of a car that he's being forced to drive. I think a B He's for me it was B teetering on A. It was not much between a B and an A for him. I think had he had some, I think there were definitely chances for more podiums here and there. There were definitely potential qualifying hasn't like usually I'm looking at the fact that he's usually qualified pretty well, but even though he's scored points, he's kind of been just dropping down rather than going up. I think that's more of this of what's happened. We look at races like Hungary where he started on pole, but he's then finishing P4. It's like unfortunately that's the only thing that's really stopped him getting an A for me. A is just these times where he's been at the front, but sometimes through no fault of his own, sometimes through just Ferrari and but sometimes just not being the best. He's unfortunately dropped off. But yeah, stick Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari outside of a Ferrari in a Mercedes in a Red Bull. You'd stick him in a McLaren this season. Let's face it, he probably would have won the world championship.
Yeah, I think it's hard to argue with the talent that Charles Leclerc has got. It's just unfortunately that talent is being spent in a Ferrari that is this era of Ferrari where they just don't know if they're coming or going. And, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see Charles give up on the Ferrari championship dream if they can't deliver for him in 2026. And there's already been rumor and speculation of him going to Aston Martin for 2027. I wouldn't be surprised to see it. But then, is that really going to be an improvement? I don't know. Could he go to Red Bull? Like, it's difficult to see where he'd really fit in because he looks like a Ferrari driver. He is the Ferrari golden boy. He was meant to be like the Monaco Schumacher, really, and that's just not happened because Ferrari haven't got it together. Yeah,
It would be so weird seeing. It's like people are like, "Oh, it's going to be so weird to see Lewis in red." It would be weird to see Charles in any other color but red.
yeah, it'd be mad, you know. Not a 5-star look, but a 5-star podcast this could be. And if you're enjoying it, we'd love it if you could take 5 to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If Louis was giving my puns and segues a rating, it would not be a 5-star review, would it? Look, it's the end of the season. Like, at this point, how many times can you say something that, leads into a segue like that? Yeah, I'm getting an F for my podcast grade, aren't I? I'm gonna stop. I'll stop at some point. Let's move on to some more positives. Obviously, we are talking about the top 10 drivers of 2025 here, and in terms of top rookies of 2025, it's hard to argue that Isaac Hadjar does not deserve this A grade that we have given him. I say that as someone that gave him a B. But, from a DNS in the first race to, as I say, arguably rookie of the year, he secured a seat at the top team for next season. Interestingly, with no Marco, no Horner, and a podium in Zandvoort. Like, could Hadjar have looked into getting that Red Bull seat at the right time, potentially?
He's definitely one lucky boy that he doesn't have to deal with Chancellor Palpatine and breathing over his shoulder, threatening to kick him out. And he's actually got quite a decent team principal in Lawrence Mekies as in head of Red Bull. I mean, he has been the antithesis of what the rookies have been this year, and that has been excellent. He has kicked off in the worst possible way, but he found his feet and then started really getting these solid runs of points. Unfortunately, you look at his finishing, you're like, well, he didn't get points every time. That Red Racing Bull has not been a brilliant car, if we're being completely honest. I said that about Lawson earlier. The Racing Bull has been this hovering car in the mid pack. This season has really been difficult for scoring points because if you look at it, we've had 4 very strong teams in McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari. That's your top 8 gone. You've only got 2 points. So getting anywhere in terms of that top 8 is really hard, but we've seen him time and time again break into that throughout the season, and that's where I give him his A grade. He has been better than a lot of teams that he shouldn't be able to outdrive, and he's done it excellently. And he's also got a podium in a car in his debut season. Incredible. And I don't know what more you can say. I think he's well deserving of that Red Bull seat next year. Is it too early? Are Red Bull making yet another horrible mistake of just pushing a driver a little too early? Who knows? Because at the end of the day, it still was probably Marco's decision to put him in that seat next season. But it's hard to argue against it. If you're looking at the sort of the Red Bull gene pool, as you may as well call it, right now, is there anyone out there that's really better? Not really. And is there any available drivers that are good enough to step into that Red Bull seat? Possibly, but that's not usually the way that Red Bull works, and I don't think Red Bull are going to try that again because Sergio Perez left them horribly mentally scarred, it would seem. But we'll see. I hope for his sake that it does work out. I hope that Red Bull can kind of break this curse of absolutely destroying rookies or just promoting drivers too soon. I think he's been great. He's had brilliant confidence through a lot of this season. I think he is well deserving of that A. And I think there's definitely a bright future for Hadjar in the future. But yeah, it's going to be a kind of sink or swim season next year. This will really define what the rest of his career is going to go, because we've seen it with Albon, we've seen it with Yuki, we've seen it with Lawson, we've seen it with Sainz, we've seen it with Ricardo. So many drivers who get put up to this team, and we've seen it to Max, and it is a sink or swim kind of fate for them. And as soon as they start to drown, they are cold.
Yeah, as you say, a brilliant season from Isaac Hadjar, and you know, has done enough to deserve that seat. But it's just a question as to whether it's too soon and whether Red Bull are going to give him the actual parity that he needs to, be able to perform. But you know, I hope it works out. He deserves to have it work out at the very least, but it's whether it happens or not. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say about it, really. A strong performance from Isaac Hadjar, that podium in Zandvoort, just incredible, really. Fairy tale, apart from the first race of the season and a couple of races where, it didn't quite go that way, but, he was there when he needed it to be. So, George Russell, an A, across the board, mid-season at a B. I think it's been a very mature season from George. He replaced that seven-time world champion Lewis Hamilton as the number one driver at Mercedes. He's been a mentor to Kimi. He's had 2 wins from pole, 9 podiums. Like, Mercedes were never really championship contenders, but they are firmly in P2, thanks to George Russell's consistency versus the rivals that they've had this season.
Yeah, I think that change from a B to an A has mostly come from the fact that we were seeing these sort of early season podiums. It was George Russell does nothing, P3. It was like George was just kind of there and he got a podium. But I think when we were sort of getting this sort of latter half of the season, we started to see more just standout performances where we're just like, whoa, look at George. Isn't he quick? Isn't he doing just a great job? And at the start of the season, we had that sense that McLaren were the fastest, and then we've had this sort of sense of Red Bull and Max pushing through. But the fact is that George was still, during those times, still able to compete with both the McLaren and the resurging Red Bull of Max Verstappen, gives him that edge of, look at him. He is doing a brilliant job. He is continuing to perform. He is upping his game, and he's doing more than enough to keep getting these podiums. Keeps George Russell made this title fight much more interesting than it would have been by stealing the podiums, by being that kind of annoying fourth driver in this championship battle who would just be there. He's like, well, he's now just ahead of Oscar. He's just ahead of Lando. He's just ahead of Max. He's just being that annoying driver that is kind of helping Max gain all this momentum, hampering the McLarens and bringing this title fight to where it ultimately came to in Abu Dhabi when there were still three drivers left in contention. Had it not been for George Russell and his consistency and his speed this year, it would have been decided probably a little sooner than it was, be it if it was a Oscar or a Lando win. So kudos to George. Thank you for making the championship fight a little bit more interesting. Thank you for at least giving us a little bit of a reprieve here and there. I don't particularly like you, but I have to respect the job that you did.
I think as well, like it's worth mentioning, George Russell has finished the season only 104 points off the tap like P1, which in modern day Formula One, that's only just over four victories. And considering he's only had two wins this season, it's that consistency he's had throughout the season that, granted the title's come down to 2 points. It's come down to 13 points between the two McLaren drivers. George Russell to only be 100 points off the title at the end of the season, I think speaks volumes because it's still got him in that position. And, looking back, Max Verstappen, I think, had something like 700 points or something last season in that Red Bull. I might just be completely misremembering and spreading absolute nonsense. That seems quite far-fetched now that I'm thinking about it. But
400.
it felt like it last season, but I might be thinking of like 2023 when he just had like more points than like the constructors teams did. But it's just
575 points, yeah.
yeah, like it's still quite a lot, and I think George Russell still being in that picture with only the two wins and stuff like that just shows the season he's had. It's you pointed it out. It went down to the wire because George Russell was in this season and in the form that he was this season. And without George Russell, we wouldn't have had the decider in the desert. There's another bunch of factors at play there too. But George Russell, I think, had probably one of his best seasons. And whilst Mercedes, ground effect era cars, it's still their first car of that season with the zero side pods that's had the best results. I think, George Russell has had probably his best season in Formula One so far. And speaking of drivers who've had their best season in Formula One so far, we get to the McLaren pair. Let's start off with Oscar Piastri. Grid Talk's given him an A. I gave him an A. You gave him an A plus. And at mid-season, of course, he had an A and was leading this championship too, I think, at that point as well. Any other season, I think Piastri might have been the champion. He was unfortunately fallible at low grip circuits and I think was also let down a bit by papaya rules. But fundamentally, I think it's been one of those performances from Oscar Piastri that could have been championship winning on any other occasion and, would have been a well deserving world champion if it had happened this season as well.
Yeah, I just want to state for the record that I gave each of the top three an A plus this season because I think they have been head and shoulders the best drivers throughout the course of this season. Oscar, by the midpoint last year, we had him an A. It wasn't like fully convincing just how good he was, but I think when it came down to it, he has been an excellent driver all year. Unfortunately, he has let it slip, but I don't think that was enough for him to be stripped of an A plus. He has driven championship worthy races throughout the season, but unfortunately did let it slip at the most unfortunate of time. Had he had this kind of blip early in the season, I think it would have done him a good, but I think he just got a bit too much for him. And we're talking about a driver who is only in his third season in Formula One. He has been incredible. He has been thrust into a championship battle that I don't think he was ultimately prepared for, but did an incredible job, a very mature, very headstrong job of leading the championship for as long as he did, putting the performances that he did for as long as he did was and still is completely unbeatable on his day. but was ultimately just let down in the end. And even though we're talking about a slip up, a bit of a drop, he's finished only 13 points off the championship, and that is absolutely commendable. His sprint this year, his sprint form has also been pretty good as well. So Oscar Piastri is a future world champion. I don't think there's any shadow of a doubt. I don't think this is the last time that we're going to see Oscar near that top end of the championship and fighting because he is incredible and absolutely the future of Formula One.
Absolutely. Like it's undeniable, I think, and the performance he put in this season was exemplary. And yeah, to also go on the record, I gave the top three drivers and the remaining drivers of this episode all the same grades as well. However, I just only gave them A's because I am harsh. I am very stingy with my A pluses. But yeah, no, absolutely. Oscar Piastri deserving of an A grade, and his teammate Lando Norris, the drivers' world champion, also gets an A from Grid Talk. Mid-season had a B from Grid Talk, and I think it just shows, he responded to his teammate's stronger first half and took the title away from him. When Piastri was struggling, Norris generally did enough to finish ahead. If you take out the retirement in Zandvoort due to that reliability, Lando Norris would have wrapped up the championship before Abu Dhabi, and the cars this at this current point in the season, well, the season we've finished the season, but the cars at this point in this regulation set had become so reliable that like you just have to think that's a very unlucky situation for Lando Norris to have been in, getting that retirement. And when you consider as well, he also, crashed into the back of his teammate in Canada, which cost him 25 points in that championship run. There's been a lot of opportunities for Lando Norris to lose this title, and fundamentally, he's won it. He has been one of the drivers of 2025, and finally, having only got his first Formula One win last season, has won a championship. And, I think I'll hand it over to you to sing the rest of the praises.
Yeah, 7 race victories this year, and as you said, had it not been for the retirement in Zandvoort, if it hadn't been for McLaren completely screwing up in Vegas, Lando would have wrapped this championship up long before Abu Dhabi. He would have probably won it nice and cleanly in Qatar, or it would have been maybe like in Vegas, for example, it would have been over long before we got to Abu Dhabi. This second half turnaround has been incredible. It's not been as good as the driver that we'll get onto, but Lando came out of the doors swinging, won the race, then just had this weird qualifying kind of mare where he kept just not doing what he wanted not what he needed to do, not even what he wanted to. He wasn't doing what he needed to do in qualifying, which ultimately stunted him for the race. And if he was going to qualify behind Oscar Piastri, he was going to finish behind Oscar Piastri at that kind of point in this season because Oscar was incredible. But ultimately, he's turned that around, not only in the championship, but also the qualifying. He managed to sort of sort out. He has finished with a better head to head than Oscar Piastri this year. And he's done what he needed to do to win the World Championship. Was it the cleanest? No. Was it the most flashy? No. But ultimately, how can you deny the world champion of an A plus A performance? Because that's what you need to do. You can't like half-ass like a championship. You've got to be good to win it. There's plenty of drivers who have been in championship winning cars that have not even touched, even scratched the surface of being world champion. We bring up the idea of Sergio Perez once again. He finished almost 300 points behind Max in 2023. But he got the wins when he needed. He got the results when he needed. That win in Australia, that win in Monaco, bouncing back, winning Austria, winning like absolute dominant win in Austria, by the way. I don't think you can deny that. Winning Great Britain, Oscar did something stupid. The win in Hungary, and then just those wins when we started getting to North America and Mexico and Brazil. That's what won him the world championship. It was that headstrong mentality, the fight back, and ultimately won the won the world championship, won 7 races. What more could you ask? And I'm very, very, very happy.
Well, just think now you no longer need to not put Lando on your grid talk predictions because he keeps losing whenever you put him in first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think anyone that's kind of trying to, cheapen Lando Norris's, championship isn't really looking at the picture of what happened in 2025. There's obviously, everybody had their favorite driver that they wanted to win. And, when you get three drivers going into the final Grand Prix of the season with a chance of winning, there's always going to be a bit of, oh, but, so and so could have won this, so and so could have won this. But, you know, the best driver at the end of the day is going to win, because it's not just about one race, it's about the entire season. Yes, there's things that, someone in charge of McLaren who has a bigger personality than he does a paycheck, like, could it have been different? Who knows, but Lando Norris is going to finish 2025 as the world champion, and you can't take that away from him because he's delivered. And it's that form that you say, when it looked like it wasn't necessarily going to be it, and he's done it. And that's the thing that's made it work for Lando Norris in 2025 as well. And let's move on to our final of the 21 drivers for 2025. We're going to move from the A grade into the A plus grade because this might as well just be called the Max Verstappen grade because I think he's got this grade every season, at least of the last few seasons that we've had for 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025 now. Max Verstappen, A plus. I gave him an A, as I've already said, but Louis, you gave him an A plus. Mid-season, we gave him a B because at that point, Red Bull just hadn't given him a car to challenge. He'd obviously got some wins at that point, thinking Japan, thinking there's definitely somewhere else that's
Imola.
not. Thank you. And Imola as well was the move of a world champion, that first corner move on Oscar Piastri, but. When everyone else has forgotten about you, you start to hear it, that dut, 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 dut in the background as it gets louder. And then I can't believe Max Verstappen managed to put himself in a position where he could have won the championship in that final race. It went down to 2 points and he won that Grand Prix as well. All he needed was Lando to just maybe get overtaken by George Russell at the start of Abu Dhabi, and that's Max Verstappen's championship. He said it himself. He pulled his way back into it due to the failings of others, but Max still had to show up and perform himself. Versus the two reliable McLarens, and he was only ever getting data from himself because Yuki was just never in the picture. Max Verstappen, I think, hands down, has been one of the standout performers of 2025, and it's a deserved grade, I think, as much as I didn't give him an A plus.
Yeah, he absolutely deserves an A plus in my opinion because of the gap. It was over 100 points, yet he managed to close it down to two, and that is incredible. Like even though he missed out on the world championship, it was a performance of a world champion, and it goes to show that Max Verstappen is one of the best drivers we've ever seen in Formula One. It is not going to change just because he isn't world champion anymore. He is a 4-time world champion for a reason. He is incredible. He is very fast. He is so smart in a car. Sometimes he's an idiot. See the Spanish Grand Prix. But aside from when Max gets very angry in the car, he is incredibly fast and has won so many of these races in the last half of the season. He won in Italy and Azerbaijan and Kota and Vegas and Qatar and Abu Dhabi. And I don't think there's much more you could have asked from Max Verstappen this season. Sure, that start of the season wasn't brilliant, but honestly, that Red Bull wasn't brilliant. It was the fourth, it was the third, so at a push, sometimes fastest car on the grid. Yet he was still getting the podiums. That first race in Australia, where he was absolutely scrapping it out with both of the McLarens, did get very fortunate with what happened with Oscar. But to keep going and keep pushing, and nobody when we were doing our mid-season driver grades would have thought Yeah, Max is gonna probably almost win the championship this year. We would have been no way. How like what are you talking about? Of course it's gonna be Oscar. Of course it's gonna be Lando who's gonna win the championship. It takes someone special to do what he did, and I will never take that away from him. It was incredible.
Incredible is the word, I think, to describe it. Red Bull would show up on a Friday. He wouldn't be happy with the car. They'd make changes overnight, show up on the Saturday. And, I think through the feedback that Max was able to give, Red Bull would be able to turn that car around into something that was capable of performing. And, he's always going to be one of those drivers that extracts the maximum out of the car, pun intended. It's always going to happen. And I think the fact as well, just going to the average positions and, I've tried not to refer to all of the statistics that have been going through it, but Max Verstappen has the best high average position finishes across Grand Prix this season, which is better than the two McLarens, and just shows the consistency he's had in that second half of the season where their two results have been a bit more up and down. Max Verstappen has done the Fernando Alonso of like 2012, where he's just had to be in that position to keep himself in the picture, and it's just madness, I think. I wrote off any chance of Max Verstappen. I think as far back as like not Silverstone, Singapore. I was saying to Owain on our review of the podcast, just like, so who's going to win it between the two McLaren drivers? Because that was the only ever picture. It's going to be one of the two McLarens, and Max Verstappen, you can't count him out. You can never count him out. And yeah, it's been incredible. It's been impressive. It's been special. And that's Max Verstappen to a T. And I think the sport, if he ever does go away from it, he keeps talking about it, will have a big hole like that needs filling because, you can just never count him out as a competitor. And, it would have been the recovery drive of history if he'd managed to do it, I think. That would have been arguably his best fought championship to overcome the gap he had and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, had he won the world championship, I don't think we have a grade high enough to
No.
give Max.
A plus plus appears on our form options.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, like, and as far as statistical patterns are concerned, do we need to be worried about a Max Verstappen championship in 2026? Because he won Abu Dhabi, and that seems to be the way it goes.
Yeah, you're never going to write Max out of a world championship. And we've seen that even when he's Red Bull start off with the worst car, he can still come back and almost win it. So if Red Bull even give him a sniff of the world championship next year, the chances are he's probably going to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. He's just got to be in the same room as a chance of winning that title, and he's gonna, put his hands on it firmly and not let go until, there's no grip left whatsoever. But yeah, I think that just about wraps up all 21 drivers. So thank you for joining me for this mammoth recording session, Louis. Is there anything you want to plug at this opportunity?
The only thing I'd like to plug is our Grid Talk socials, which is at Grid Talk UK on pretty much any social media platform with the ats. We have just wrapped up our own championship on Grid Talk, the Predictions Championship, which was won by, well, go to our socials and you can find out who won the Grid Talk Predictions Champions, and we'll wonder if they can hang on to it next year. It wasn't so much a comeback when it was more of a dominant Max 2024 kind of esque win by our champion. But yes, do go over to our socials, and while the season might be over, Grid Talk will hopefully still be pushing some good content your way. So please make sure to go give us a follow to keep in the loop.
Yes, please do keep in the loop. And if you want to hear more from me, I'm at Ruby Rose Price on Instagram. And Grid Talk is available on YouTube as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us over on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content? And also make sure you subscribe so you're the first to know when each new new weekly episode is released. We'll be back soon with plenty more F1 content. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast, presented by Green Wheels, and goodbye.